good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're watching this. Welcome back to our next session for the third day of our content track at the LSX World Congress 2021. Today, the Capital Deployment and Commercialization Strategy Day. Delighted to be introducing our next panel now, titled If I'd Known Then What I Know Now, Best Practices for Entering the US Market. Please do keep asking your questions and making your comments in the Q&A and chat functions to the right-hand side of the video here. And our speakers and panelists be sure to respond and indeed connect and maybe answer any questions privately if needs be. And yeah, please do also sort of connect with each other through the partnering platform and live at the event as it goes on. But for now, delighted to hand you over to our moderator for today's panel, Teresa Levoy with Fish & Richardson. Teresa, the stage is yours.
Great, thank you, Josh. As Josh mentioned, welcome to our panel. The title is If I Had Known Then What I Know Now, Best Practices for Entering the US Market. I'm thrilled today to have this experienced set of panelists to discuss this with you. We hope it's a lively conversation. If you have any questions, please feel to enter them in the chat. We'll try to address those either live or at a later time if you're looking at this remotely. My name is Teresa Levoy. I'm a principal with the law firm of Fish & Richardson. My practice focuses on biotech and biopharma startups in both the small molecule space as well as the biologic space. Darren, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thanks very much for inviting me to be part of the panel. Hopefully we'll have some lively discussion. So I'm a scientist first and foremost, turned entrepreneur with no formal training and an investor, and I've been involved in starting, growing or investing over 40 life science, technology or social enterprises. One of my major focuses is on strategy and governance and capital markets sort of strategies. I've raised well over $500 million in private public market financing, and I've had experience, the good, the bad and the ugly of starting, scaling and exiting companies, both through M&A strategies and through public market liquidities. I've been on record quite commonly as saying startups need to put scale up on their agenda from day one. And this particularly includes strategies for entering and operating in their key markets, not just their home markets or the markets that are convenient to the time at which they're raising particular capital. So I'm looking forward to contributing.
Thank you. Nana, could you go next?
Great. Thanks very much, Teresa. So I'm Nana Lunborg. I'm a partner with Nova Ventures in Copenhagen, Denmark. So Nova Ventures is one of the largest and most active investors in the biotech and crossover space. We have a team of 30 people across 4 offices, London, Copenhagen, San Francisco, and Boston. And over the last few years, we've been investing upwards of $500 million US. We have a portfolio of around 70 different companies across both private and public. Within the European team, that effort is led by myself and my colleague Naveed Siddiqui and the rest of our investment team in Europe. And I think it's fair to say that all our deals tend to have a bit of a combined European and US flavor. If we're also, as a fund, very much both US and European focused, and see ourselves as an investor that can be helpful in supporting portfolio companies, both as they look to transition from being privately funded to entering the public markets, but also in building out their US team, US presence, US strategy overall. So happy to be part of the panel today.
Great, thank you. Jan, could you go next?
Thank you, Teresa. So I'm Jan Mattsson. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer and co-founder of Albireo. And we'll talk more about Albireo, obviously, during this session. But it's a company focused on pediatric liver disease in particular. So we'll come back to that. I'm a chemist, biochemist by training, PhD in biochemistry. Spent 17 years at AstraZeneca in various indications, various disease areas. And then started Albireo in 2008. And then the rest is history, as we say. We'll talk about that. But moving from the big pharma to biotech and private biotech to a public entity in the US. So that's where we are now.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Jason, could you go next?
Sure, thank you. My name is Jason Duncan. I'm the Chief Legal Officer and General Counsel for Albireo, working with Jan and others. I began my career at a large law firm here in Boston in this sort of very esoteric area of corporate finance. Frankly, didn't know much about life sciences when I was in law school. or even starting out as a young lawyer, I probably would have gone in the other direction if I had heard something about science in those times, because I was in law school because I didn't quite understand math and science as well. But over the course of my career, started doing more work with life sciences companies as a outside lawyer, then went in-house to a company called E&D Serono, and was there for a number of years before becoming the lead lawyer for their main therapeutic area in neurology. And then began a couple of different jobs with smaller companies, less established companies, sort of building out their legal operations. Ultimately landing at Albareo just about 3 years ago in this role, and learned throughout all those experiences that, you know, building teams and being closer to the business, even when resources are challenged, was more congenial to me as a lawyer and as a business person. And so I'm looking forward to sharing some more stories and some things that went well.
Great. Thanks so much, Jason. Well, why don't we just jump right into it? As the title said, if I had known then what I know now. Why don't we start with Darren? Darren, you've, as you indicated, a successful entrepreneur, seeing a variety of exits with a variety of different companies. Do you have some lessons learned for similarly situated companies, ideas or advice on what companies should be doing now in order to derive success and maximize their opportunities? And what are some common mistakes that you've seen?
Yes, indeed. I'll start from first principles. I've had the benefit of working extensively with the entrepreneurial community, whether it be academic scientists spinning out or business-focused entrepreneurs through the student entrepreneurship community. And you see the same problems and challenges coming up time and time again. I mean, to me, business is quite simple in terms of number of steps, but there are sort of variables that sort of come into that. So if you were looking at now about looking at an investment, for example, and asked an angel investor what they look for, having gone through this a number of times, they would say, do businesses fail because of technology? Well, they can if you invest in them early enough with high risk, but good entrepreneurs tend to be able to sort of pivot their technologies into markets. They can fail because of markets, because of usually lack of qualification of the market and prioritization of market and adopting the strategies, but they mostly fail because of human factors or get into difficult because of human factors. And that's all to do with alignments. And if you're going to build a business over 10, 15 years, you're gonna have to align a very complex, disparate group of stakeholders who all measure their success at different points in time, very carefully on and off the bus to earn that right to turn world-class science through commercial success onto sort of scalable, sustainable business ventures. And the three simple steps, and I'm gonna give you examples of where it goes well, where it goes badly. So people start businesses usually because they see a group of people somewhere are being treated unfairly, and they think I can do something about that. And so they start with that mission that this is the mountain we must climb together. Now that's great and noble, but often that's a 20-year vision, and people have chosen a company in order to be able to deliver on that vision that operates in different cycles with different sort of stakeholders. And so the temptation is to just charge up the mountain, raise the first funding available, address the markets you can, and you start building in, misalignments that are going to impact your ability to enter your biggest markets. For example, in the US, you haven't focused on that, and to sort of bring stakeholders along. Whereas I think what they should start doing is looking very simple at the fundamentals. On strategy, people, what is strategy? To me, it's just very simple. It's where we play around there. And it's more specifically that, it's where do we play now in the future. Now, most companies that I've seen, young companies, they look at their local market and they look at where they can raise funding to get things going. And they think, well, we can play here now, so this is where we should play. And that's the wrong way to be looking at it. It should be from the beginning, looking at your strategy, is that this is where we should play. This is our major opportunity. This is where we can position and disrupt. We may have some challenges. So we may need to do this in a stepwise fashion, but then we need to bring investors or other stakeholders on board who will support that kind of strategy. Otherwise, you're stuck at where you sort of limited from your beginning demographic. Then on the execution,
can I just jump in there? And I don't want to stop your flow.
No, I was doing a soliloquy. You can jump in.
No, that's great. But how does someone who's a new entrepreneur, right? Who hasn't done this before, doesn't have a network of VCs to talk to, doesn't have a network of, you know, seasoned entrepreneurs to bounce ideas. How do they know where to put, you know, they got an idea, they decide I'm going to leave my company, I'm going to start a business, right? And this is what I want to do. How do they get to that point, right? Rather than it being sort of a closed loop of entrepreneurs that start the next company, bring it public, you know what I mean? How do we do that?
I find that, when I first started, that question you just asked was unanswerable.
Mhm.
Because it was like a closed loop. There were very few people who had been there, done that, bought the T-shirt, and were prepared
Right.
to give back. That isn't the
Yep.
case anymore. It may be in some areas outside of sort of the key US, European, UK, other sort of biotech, tech hubs, etc. But there is a lot of people now, I would just be one of those people, who give a lot of time back. In fact, it's their passion in terms of how they can make people avoid those pitfalls and put them on the right path. So the bottom line is they have to find the network. So they have to participate, and you can go to student entrepreneurship events. All the universities, tech transfer offices have these supports. A lot of the VCs now have outreach, corporates, etc. around there. You have to find sort of someone there if you've got no fundamentals at all around there. Otherwise, you're relying on, like I did, good old common sense, getting enough things right that you didn't go bankrupt. In my first sort of 11 companies, 3 did not work, but fortunately enough, they, some by good skill, some by luck, it didn't put me out of the game, and I was able to sort of play again later. But now I don't think that's necessary. I think there is always someone you can find to have that discussion.
I'd
yes,
like to jump in and I agree with a lot of things that Darren has said. I do also think that like the kind of age that we live in does make it so much easier. I mean, I get contacted on LinkedIn all the time by kind of ambitious students in the US or in India, all over the place, that want to know how to get into VC or want to know if we're interested in funding their company. I mean, we're not doing seed stage investing in Nova Ventures, but I used to be in Nova Seeds, and I have a lot of colleagues that are in the earlier stage space. I think people are usually very happy to share like a few minutes of their time and give a couple of pointers of, that's not relevant for us, but why don't you go and speak to this person or that person. But I think what Darren is saying about building for success is really one of the key lessons, and it's one of the big things that I think has been a very positive shift in the European biotech scene in the last few years, that I think we're seeing many more European biotech companies really building for success, and instead of trying to be the best Danish company or the best French company, just being the best company full stop in their specific area, and trying to build the right board for that specific indication and opportunity they're going after, trying to build the right investor syndicate, not looking at kind of their local remit, because we don't need to be sort of shackled to our nationality or our regional focus anymore in the same way that I think 20 years ago was probably more necessary. And I think that is actually making a big difference in leveling the playing field and making a lot of the European biotechs, just as attractive as their US brethren.
Exactly. Being the best cell therapy company in country X might mean you're the 150th best in the world.
Exactly. Just not a very interesting comparison, because it's a very global sort of field of competition that we're all playing in, right?
Yeah, can I add? I think you're right there. I think it's changed now that companies are looking for, beyond the like in Sweden, you look beyond in Europe and even to US these days. I think still there are this kind of thinking that you stay in the country, as was mentioned, and you kind of keep there and you wait for a fantastic event of an exit or something. And I think we even, back in the days did that a little bit. I think we did a mistake in terms of, but not going to the US earlier and getting to know that market in terms of investors. We did a little bit, but I think once we got there, we had a big uphill to get to know investors, and they didn't know who Albrio was and so on. So I think early on, think big.
Yep. I think there has been that massive shift over the last decade. And, you started a little bit more than a decade ago, Jan, of sort of, as Nana said, it's a much more connected world, right? And there's a bigger group of people who've done it now out there, VCs, entrepreneurs, successful and big pharma and big biotech sort of looking to these companies worldwide rather than just sort of locally. as well.
Coming back to just following on, just to finish off my
Right.
answer,
Yep.
so we talked about strategy, and then we get on to execution, which is how are we going to win? How are we going to organize ourselves to win? People are pretty good at, how we win, but they make huge mistakes early on how we're going to organize ourselves to win. And this is the biggest problem with human factors, right? If I see another company that has 3 equal co-founders who've given each other a third of the shares each, when each have only put it, one person's a Nobel laureate who's put in 30 years, one's an MBA student who's put in about 3 months around there, and they've all got the pieces of paper around there. I mean, I'll just literally shoot myself. And this is setting a company up for failure from day one, right? You need to have brutal, honest discussions about what your motives are. If Nana wants to make $100 million and I want to cure cancer, that's absolutely fine if we can find the right strategy, execution, and sort of governance sort of plans to kind of deliver on that. But that doesn't happen, and I've seen that tear so many companies apart or create really complex capital sort of structures, if you like, that make it very difficult to sort of raise reinvestment on good terms. And then the final dirty word, which I've embraced dramatically, is governance. How are we going to hold ourselves accountable to each other and to each stakeholder along the line? That just sounds boring, right? But it's really, if you're charging up that mountain and you've done your business plan and you've assessed all the risks and rewards, you've pointed your cannons and aligned your people to a particular path up. Well, if you keep charging up without looking behind at how you're doing, and more importantly, bringing all the people along who've backed you, you don't know how you're doing. And if you need to change course, which you will, even in the most successful companies around there, you won't be able to bring those people along. You won't be able to communicate with them effectively about what's gone wrong. So you end up running the company blind, and that's where these companies run into steam. So your strategies and your execution and governance needs to be, I would argue, world-class early. You plan for success. So with Mogrify, we run it like a pseudo-public company from day one. It has the benefit that investors will always give you the benefit of the doubt and back you within reason. Around there, you don't treat it like a job creation scheme. Around there, it isn't about you, it's about the reason you started your business. Those people who are being treated unfairly, and you've asked other people for their hard-earned money in order to be able to get you there, and that has a duty of care associated with it when it comes to execution and governance. So you need to be global, and if you don't think global, you can set, it has impacts on corporate structure, on capital market strategies, on your operations. Do you set up locally when actually the talent you need to compete in this market is actually overseas, maybe often in the US in biotech around there? So should you be thinking early around there? When you partner, whether it be the assets or whether you partner on a commercial level, the temptation is to hand over your business development to third parties around there rather than trusting yourself and your passion, your advocacy and advocacy of your partners, early partners to help you. And that this can lead to real major challenges. I'm going to leave it at that point. I can come in with some anecdotes later, but I'm aware that I've taken up a little bit of time so far.
Anna, could you talk to this idea of governance and accountability and bringing along, and how how Novo approaches that, just sort of generally, making sure that there's alignment, looking at that, as Darren said, sort of the founders, and how, really recognizing, having those hard conversations, right, about the contribution of each person and what that may mean, at the beginning versus later with subsequent investors and partners coming in.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something we end up spending a lot of time on as well. And I think it is often something that becomes a bit of a difficult conversation for a lot of founders, because at the end of the day, by the time a company needs to raise, 50 to 100 million euros, dollars, whatever, which is the type of financing round. So we would come into, I mean, that's a capital need that usually the founders can only get from raising venture dollars, right? Mm-hmm. Or from being able to take the company public. And usually a venture round is a stepping stone to being able to go public. And so I think a lot of founders will become very concerned about the governance ask that you have from investors. On the other hand, I think once you sort of talk them down the path of, well, we're investing, I'm investing Novo's money here, mm-hmm. in this business plan, and the governance controls that we're asking for is to really hold you to deliver on that business plan, so that right. We're not coming into this company with a 10 or 15% investment. We're not a controlling investor in terms of our pure shareholding, but unless we have some governance control, we have no way of stopping you from turning this business along some whole, completely new, different business plan.
Yeah.
Or just pursuing some other opportunity that is not what we've signed up to. So we would normally look at our investment horizon being the next 2 to 3 years. And that's typically around clinical inflection points, clinical milestones, maybe regulatory milestones as well. And so I think the governance controls that we put in place is really to make sure that we're all keeping each other honest and saying, this is the experiment we're going to do. This is how we're going to run the company. This is the plan we're going to deliver on. And if everyone does that, then we're not going to need to kind of pull the brake on any of these sort of governance measures that we put in place.
You've highlighted an error that companies make here. They only look at it through that prism that's just been described, which is the internal to external. The major benefits of governance, a consequence if you communicate everything in how you're doing against your plans and versus your agreed inflections to external stakeholders, is you get that alignment and you can bring people along to support you. But actually the main benefit is holding yourselves internally to account versus your strategies, execution plans, and to each other in terms of your motives and various things like that, which again, they will all involve. The danger is you think everything internal is fine, and this is an external group of people we just need to manage. We've got everything covered internally, so that's probably the bigger mistake that I've seen. And a consequence of that is poor management of external stakeholders.
Yeah, I think that's a good comment, but I think it's also I think where these things do come to a head, if I would say, everything is easy if everything's going well, right? I mean, if a company is executing to their plan, delivering on their milestones, typically their board and investors are happy, and there's no issue. Where things go awry, or where some kind of roadblock comes up, some negative data, some delays, COVID pandemic, whatever it is hits, that's usually where it becomes more difficult and where you have more challenging conversations.
Yeah.
One phrase: no surprises.
Yes.
If you've got really good governance in place and you want to be careful with that, no surprises. People can live with adjustments and changes if they've been brought along. They've seen it all from investing or participating in other companies. And if you do it correctly, they still may not be happy because things aren't going as well, but they'll understand the adjustments and you'll be able to make them.
Let's pivot a bit to asking Jan and Jason a bit about Albireo, which is a biopharmaceutical company that has locations in both Sweden and Boston. So Jan, you've given a little bit of the background. Could you give a little bit more of when and how you started Albireo and what motivated your interest, and a little bit about the status of odevixibat, of its submission in both the US and European regulatory agencies?
Sure, yeah. As I said, I used to work at AstraZeneca for many years, and in 2006 or 7-ish, there was a big strategic change with AstraZeneca, and a number of programs were kind of shelved, and so did some of our favorite programs, actually, around bile acids and bile acid modulators. So we actually discussed with AstraZeneca to move those out, and that was they were very helpful in that, and that was the start of Albireo. So we took a couple of programs. We went around to VCs in Europe, mostly actually at that time. And I think we got a really good response, and we got a $40 million Series A immediately. So we were really lucky with great investors backing the company from the start. So at the point we didn't actually have odevixibat in our plans. It was iluvixabat, another bile acid modulator, which we took then through a number of clinical studies, successful phase 2b, and then we partnered to a Japanese company, EA Pharma, which now has actually that drug approved in Japan for chronic constipation. So very different from where we went at that point. We started on to think about liver diseases and bile acids in liver diseases, and realized we have some interesting compounds that could be used for liver disease, and in particular cholestatic liver diseases. So we started off with odevixibat, and at the point when we had the first clinical data, we then realized that we will be able to take this the whole way to commercial, actually. And that was the point when I and the board started to discuss we need to go to the US. So we realized that, me being a scientist, for example, I don't know anything about commercial side. We need someone that, knows that commercial side to be, the investors will believe in the story. So that's when Ron Cooper came in, who had tons of experience from his days at BMS as a commercial leader there. So that was the start. And then, we started off in, moving into US, and again, the rest is history. But I think, Jason, you may take over a little bit from the US point of side. I could talk a little bit more, later maybe about the first couple of days in the US, which was pretty interesting. But
Sure. Well, I think to pick up on what Jan was saying, the company knew that it needed to access the capital markets in the US to continue to advance its products. And it ultimately did so in what is now, I guess, a bit more common, but was unique at that point. They underwent a reverse merger to get their listing on NASDAQ to access the markets that way. But I joined sort of after they had gone through that process, but I've heard the stories of when the company's footprint in the US was something like a table and a few chairs in a pizza place near a train station. And, the company slowly built and had gained office space in Boston. And I think decided on Boston because of the ecosystem there. I mean, biotech and pharma in Boston and Cambridge is sort of what we do in these parts. And we've got academic institutions, we have healthcare institutions, there are financial institutions all together in the same place. So it made it an obvious choice to set up the US headquarters. And just to touch on sort of what Darren was talking about a little bit and what Jan mentioned, Darren with human factor and Jan in what the company was thinking about as they were looking for a CEO to access the US. It was very smart for the company to look at someone like Ron Cooper, who yes, has experience in science and can speak the science by background, but he's a commercial person and had a very deep experience with his commercial role at BMS, and was able then at quite an early stage for the company to be thinking about the future and helping shape the strategy with that mindset. And also what Jan touched on, I hope I won't embarrass him too much, but Jan is a chemist and a scientist, and an excellent one at that, but he's also a business-minded person, an entrepreneurial person. And that has been critically important for the company as well. And Jan and others, thought about what the company needed in terms of leadership and where the team could best play and how it should be constructed. And that's a big part of the success for the company.
Jason, can you tell us a bit about the status of the submissions for odevixibat and the indication, for example?
Sure. Well, we have submitted our applications in both the US and the EU for odevixibat, seeking approval within our lead indication is PFIC, and an ultra rare disease, pediatric liver disease. And we submitted those pretty close to the same period of time, both the US and the EU. And we've just announced that those have been accepted by the regulatory agency. So we're very excited about that.
Great. It sounds like a logistical feat to be able to do that submission in both jurisdictions, right? Can you talk a bit about the teams you put in place to do that, and how they managed to sort of move the trains forward, on time to be successful and get that done? Because from my own experience, I've seen clients and companies, do the US, and Europe might be close behind, but typically not so close together. And as an outside patent attorney working with you and Jan, I was just floored at how well executed that was. And maybe the audience would like to hear some tips on that for you in order to be able to just sort of maximize the synergies there.
Sure. Well, not to be too glib, I think one of the successful things is make sure your chief legal officer and general counsel isn't the one responsible for it. I mean, I think we've been very lucky in that the teams that we have in place have always worked very well together in both the US and the EU. We're not so big, right? We're only, getting up to, at this point, 75 or 80 people. So we're not talking about mid or even large pharma. That's an advantage if you harness it the right way. And I think our team, our regulatory team, and Jan's team, and the clinical team in particular, did that very well. We are not a siloed organization. And so to Darren's earlier point, the team set out an objective to have these submissions happen close to one another, obviously months and months and months, even years beforehand. And we're able to pull in outside resource as needed to help them, strategically, but also to stay oriented on that task as they marched forward. So that, at the point when we had the data that we knew would be supportive of those applications, we were able to trigger a process we had already thought quite a bit about. I think another part of the success, and Jan will embellish and fix me, but I think another big part of the success is the way that the team communicates. We are a culture that appreciates productive disagreements in service of the overall strategy, even if it's uncomfortable. We are not a culture where the most important meeting is the one that happens in the hallway before the actual scheduled meeting. We don't operate like that. And that enables us to move quickly and have transparency with one another, and to ultimately land on the best decision for whatever the objective is. And certainly in the process of going through those submissions, there was opportunity for productive disagreements, and we had it, and it served us well. So I think transparency and trust within the team is critically important.
Just to add to that, I think, for others to do this, I think we have been lucky, and we have always planned, the people we employ. I think we had luck to get in a fantastic experienced chief of regulatory, Martha Carter, has done this many times in the US and in Europe. We have fantastic members of the team who have been through this before. And, it's a huge amount of planning, huge amount, but you have to know what the end results should be. And the teams really know that. And the second thing I think is, you need then to motivate people to do this. And I think in our case, it was really that we made everyone aware what we're trying to do, what kind of patients we are trying to treat here. And when we're trying to treat this severe pediatric liver diseases, and we have, everyone in the company knows that there's no medicines for these kids, and I think that motivation clearly made people work over weekends and day and night for this, because it's not about money, it's not about their careers, it's about getting this medicine to this suffering kid, and get kids, and get hope for families, as we say. I think that was a big motivator to drive it.
Yeah. As Darren said, no surprises, right? So even though that you're building in, the people know what the goal should be, but they also have seen lots of surprises, right?
Yeah.
And so they're planning in the pivot points and the changes, but still trying to hit that end point as necessary.
Yeah, and what I heard from Darren on that is about credibility and transparency, both externally and internally. It's not that things won't happen. You can't anticipate everything. Can't anticipate, for instance, a global pandemic necessarily. That's going to have a major impact on your business, but you can plan, and you can be transparent with each other and externally, and make sure that you're credible. And that credibility is a huge asset for the company, and it's easily lost. And once it seems to me, once you lose that, it's very difficult to come back.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I
Derek,
think that's a great comment, and actually one that is just as, I mean, it's obviously absolutely essential once you're a public company, but it's actually very important for early stage companies as well. I mean, I think it's you know, if some earlier stage companies are sort of watching this and thinking about what key lessons they can take away from it, I think you know, certainly a lesson is, you know, you can never start too early with building connections to the right stakeholders wherever they may be, whether that's investors or KOLs or people you want to work with as you take the business forward. But also that you need to have a consistent story and a consistent timeline. You know, it is a fairly small industry. Expect that people are taking notes. If you're meeting the same investor 2 years later and your timelines have changed or your story has changed, be prepared to answer questions on that, because people notice. People are going to be aware that, hang on, I thought you were going to be in the middle of your phase 2 in 2021. That was what you told me when we met in 19. So I think it's a very relevant point, even for earlier stage companies as well.
Teresa, I'd just like to address the war stories element, if you don't mind, and give you sort of some references onto what I think now is best practice versus what we did well and bad at Horizon, going from IP to IPO in 6 years, but then we scaled up by a lot of 4 acquisitions. And there was some good, bad, ugly in there, and perhaps reference that to what I think is best practice now. So you know, the real key when you get your plan is to really qualify early what your key market demographics are, and then the strategies and tactics to be able to adopt them. And the timing of where you do a number of activities. I think up front, you do activities that are pretty obvious, really, which is creating customer awareness. That's in terms of your communication strategies. I argue boots on the ground. At Horizon, we used to just move to cities in the US and where conferences were going and say, we're not leaving until we've got this amount of sort of traction around there. We had to stay out and away from families for as long as that took in order to be able to achieve that goal. But at what point do you then put boots on the ground, for example? And I think one of the challenges is you're seduced by some slick talking business development execs and people who've run companies before who are now leveraging back in. And I think we certainly we partnered with a couple of companies early for their scale in terms of, and they were just truly horrible. You know, 1 or 2 people, motivated founders, scientists like myself, outsold them 10 to 1 around there, but our confidence was not high enough in order. So the timing of when you bring those, for example, distribution channels, for example, in the case of a company like Horizon, was fundamentally important. So that physical presence, I think understanding when you're going to have to put that in. On the investment side, you know, I would argue right now, I'm going through this at the moment with Mogrify, you know, our capital market strategy is US from day one. You know, you may tactically bring in some money from Europe and corporates and various things like that, but everything we're doing on awareness and engagement and building through working with US IR firms, already speaking to crossover funds, public market funds. Obviously, I've had the experience of raising a lot of money there before, so you know quite a few people, but putting that strategy in place, I think it first is really important. And the final bit is talent. Sometimes you're just constrained in your local demographic that you are never going to be able to recruit the best and relevant talent in order to enter that US and dominate that US market. So whether that be at the legal, the IP, the process development, regulatory, or actually key sort of preclinical, clinical development, you know, we're hiring some very senior positions right now in Mogrify, and it's been a nightmare because you can only recruit them from the West Coast. From the East Coast, you get right the way down to contract discussions, acceptance of contracts even, and then pullouts at the last minute, people not wanting to move to Europe, et cetera, et cetera. And so getting sort of a grip on all of these things up front is really, really important.
But do you think they need to move? I mean, I think, I'm on the board of 4 different portfolio companies at the moment, and in all 4, we have split US-European management teams. And it's not to say
depends on the role. I mean, do they have any operations in the US? I mean, so for example, in our case, we're looking at people to run immunology, ophthalmology franchises, and a sort of, if you like, head of therapeutic development, hybrid CSO, CMO kind of role. So I guess it depends on the role. I'm perfectly comfortable. I've worked remotely a lot of my career, And it hasn't sort of held me in, and a lot of people do. So, for example, my business development team at Mogify are all here. I'm here in Costa Rica. I can get to my house in California. We can do face-to-face if we want. Another one's in the Bahamas, normally would be in the UK. It's now sort of flying in and out around there. So, so I'm very comfortable with people being remote. I just think maybe for some roles, if you've got quite a lot of physical operation in Europe, how much can they do it on a split basis? Are they doing it split or entirely from the US?
No, so I mean, I think the sort of standard setup, I would say, for a biotech R&D stage company is to have usually the R&D operations, the scientists would be in Europe where the company is founded. Typically, that might be in close proximity to the founder lab or, excuse me, founder university where the science came from, and then have parts of the management team, typically the CFO, investor relations, capital markets facing activities, could be the CEO, but not necessarily, will be in the US, and then clinical operations will be in the US as companies get to having larger clinical trials and having a significant number of US sites.
Definitely works. I have one last war story, and that's it. And I'm going to give you sort of a revelation here. For those who are familiar with the Horizon story, there's an orphan project in gene editing technology from the US. We brought it to the UK and then spent the IP to IPO period, 6 years, exporting predominantly, 80% of our revenues and things back to the US. And that got us in a position to go public and sort of do a $130 million IPO. Now that all sounds really great, right? And we did a lot of things I'm talking about well, understanding where our prime markets were, executing against them, etc. What we did really badly, which seems strange given that early investors made 50 times their money back and everyone made money in proportion to the stage they came in, was the capital market strategy. We loaded the deck with high net worth individuals, angel investors. We delivered revenues, didn't need to raise money, so everyone wanted to invest naturally. We kept ordinary share structures, no preferences, etc. So we brought venture capital in much later. Now, that sounds really great from a founder and early investor perspective, but in reality, I think ultimately the investors that came in 2 years before the IPO probably paid too high a price out of excitement. And we then had really few options. We couldn't go to NASDAQ with the capital sort of structure we had, the EIS sort of loading. We had to go to a market where you could maintain that around there. So we did the UK IPO, which was spectacular. It was the 5th biggest in the world that year, 2nd biggest in the research platforms ever. And that all sounds really, really great, but we ended up with a deck of very generalist investors, 62 meetings, 61 investors. It was a real challenge sort of to keep that. The VCs exited quite early around there. And then in order to scale in the US, we did a lot of acquisitions. So we only raised 20 million sterling pre-IPO. I think we raised 250 million sort of post the IPO, and we acquired 3 US companies so that we could have a position in both in vitro, in vivo gene editing, expand the platform into drug combinations. We ended up with 150,000 square feet of facilities in Kendall Square, in St. Louis, and in Boulder, Colorado, et cetera, around there. And we tried through those acquisitions to diversify the shareholder base with US investors. And we got to about 40% by the time I stood down, but they were still pretty generalist. And some of them were a bit of a hangover. We had brought in the Deerfields, Perceptives, Asymmetries, Federateds, et cetera, and that helped, but they weren't embedded in the company's sort of DNA. And the UK holders had been in for 5 years at this point, and they were itching for a liquidity rather than another 5-year investment into leveraging this $80 million revenue business into cell and gene therapy. And there became that tension between those two groups. And that kind of ultimately was led to why I would have stepped down at that point. I'd been there 11 years anyway, so I think I was a bit worn out at that stage, if I'm honest. But it meant that when they did that and they went on for another 2 or 3 years, it ran out a little bit of steam from a capital markets perspective. And ultimately they ended up being acquired quite recently by PerkinElmer after about 14 years of the company in. So capital market strategy, you really, if you want longevity in your business and not exit like that, you have to think about not just the earlier stage shareholders, but how you make those transitions.
Yeah. And I think attending this type of event is great for people because I think if they're early entrepreneurs and haven't been through it before and seen how things play out like that, right? It's sometimes the focus is I need this now, right? Versus what is this going to look like 5 years from now and 10 years from now, right? So getting that input from your network from your building that early. Go ahead, Darren.
But that's why that discussion is really important back at the beginning.
Yep.
What are your motivations for doing this? And then be transparent with them, to each other, to the stakeholders and investors you're bringing in. There's nothing wrong with the $10 million versus curing cancer if you can align that. But if you get it wrong, even if it goes commercially well, someone loses out at some point along the line if you don't do it right.
Okay. I think we have just a few minutes left. Jason or Jan, anything to add to that?
Just add one thing from my experience. I talk to new companies starting right now. I think people are afraid of getting in venture cap too early. I think to get in a experienced venture cap firm, or a couple of them, I think is very, very helpful. And for us, that was kind of key to get when we were starting to get into US. I mean, we needed investors that were backing us and had the kind of the cash to put in at that point, because it's really expensive. And their experience also helps to build the investor network. So don't be afraid of bringing in venture cap early on, I would say.
Great, thank you. Well, I think our time is out. I want to thank all the panelists for attending today. I learned a lot, and it was, I think, hopefully the attendees will as well. Definitely everyone who's listening, feel free, if you're watching this later, to reach out to any of us. We're happy to answer any questions. And I guess now it goes back to Josh, and enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Jake, thanks, Teresa, and thanks, as Teresa said, to all of our panel, to Darren, to Jan, to Jason, and to Nana. Some great insights there, and yeah, please do keep the conversation going. The chat and Q&A function will remain open for those questions. Please do visit, Fish and Richardson's exhibition virtual booth, and connect with them that way as well. Yeah, hope you all learned something new this morning for you young entrepreneurs out there on how to sort of build and grow your business. We're back at 11 o'clock. Our next session is focused on female founders, encouraging, developing, and commercializing talent. So I'll be handing over to my colleague Angela for that session. But please do join us then. And thanks again to our panel. See you soon.